They looked away, and that's the kindest thing I've ever known. The Texas heat burned white that morning, so bright it erased the line between sky and dust. The trucks came slow, their engines coughing through the dry air, carrying 23 German women who hadn't spoken in hours. The road shimmered, the smell of oil and cedar thick in the wind. Inside the truck, their uniforms, grey, torn, sun-faded, clung to thin shoulders and faces that no longer remembered softness. They were nurses, clerks, typists. What was left when an army died? The war was over, but its rules still lived inside them. Don't look, don't ask, don't trust. The gates of Camp Hearn creaked open. It didn't look like a prison. No barbed wire, no floodlights, just wooden fences, a windmill, and rows of barracks that gleamed dull in the sun. A few guards waited at the gate, most no older than 25 Texans. Ranch hands turned soldiers, their faces tanned and still. Captain Seth Marshall stood at the front, 33. Lean, quiet. Before the war, he'd broken horses, not men. His orders for this camp were simple. No touching, no shouting, no shame. The women climbed down slowly, blinking against the glare. No one shouted. No one reached for them. A guard offered his hand to help, but when the nearest woman flinched, he stopped, hand frozen in the air before lowering it again. Helene Richter, 24, stepped down last. Her boots hit the dirt with a soft thud. She expected a shove, a command. None came. Marshall nodded once. "You'll have water and rations shortly," he said. The translator repeated it in German. She didn't believe it. That afternoon they were shown their barracks, wooden planks, clean beds, thin mattresses. One of the women touched a pillow like it was glass. The guard said, "You'll wash before supper." The word wash froze them. They exchanged glances. They had heard stories, rumors whispered through prison trains in Europe. The showers, the humiliation, the laughter of men who didn't turn away. Sundown came, the air turned gold, the wind quieter. The women gathered outside the shower house, a low tin building with 2 doors and a single water tank humming above it. The guards lined up outside. None entered. None looked back. Helene stared at them through the open doorway. "They're waiting," she whispered to the woman beside her. "For what?" "To see us," she said. But when the water began to fall, they didn't hear laughter, no commands, just the slow sound of water hitting skin and the steady rhythm of boots standing guard outside. Seth Marshall stood near the windmill, hands behind his back, the setting sun throwing his shadow long across the dust. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Inside, the women stood beneath warm water, trembling, eyes shut, waiting for the cruelty that never came. And for the first time since the war began, they washed without fear. They had arrived in America carrying 2 kinds of fear, what they remembered and what they had been told. In Germany, surrender meant shame. The soldiers whispered about camps in foreign lands, about women stripped of everything, about Americans who hated as fiercely as they fought. For the nurses and clerks now standing in Texas dust, capture was supposed to be the end of dignity. They were told that the enemy would make them pay for every wound, every bombed village, every dead boy in a foreign field. The journey across the Atlantic had been a blur of silence, rumors, and prayer. "If they take your clothes," one woman had said, "they'll take your name next." But when the truck stopped at Camp Hearn, the script fell apart. The Americans didn't curse. They didn't sneer. They didn't reach for them. The guards looked away as the women climbed down, as if the act of seeing would break something fragile. That was the first confusion. The second came that evening when the order was given to shower. The women froze. It wasn't the water that frightened them. It was the memory of the word douche, shower room. They'd heard what that meant in other camps, the ones that left no survivors to confirm or deny. When the door closed behind them, the panic was silent, but total. A few clutched their towels like shields. One woman whispered, "They will watch." But they didn't. Outside, the men stood still. 10 guards, 10 paces from the door, rifles resting against their shoulders, faces turned toward the fields. They could hear the water start, the pipes rattling in the walls. Private Davis shifted uneasily. "Sir," he said, "should we?" Captain Marshall cut him off. "We guard from the outside, that's all." The water ran inside. The first woman stepped under the stream. It was warm, not scalding, not cold, just water falling in rhythm, washing away dust and disbelief. One by one, the others followed. The sound changed. Less like panic, more like breathing. When they emerged, hair damp, uniforms clinging to their skin, the men didn't move, didn't stare, didn't speak. The air between them and the guards was heavy, charged, like the silence between confession and forgiveness. Helene lingered near the doorway, eyes scanning the line of motionless men. They didn't look, she whispered. Inge beside her frowned. Maybe they're ashamed. Helene shook her head. No, they're protecting us. Outside, Marshall finally spoke. You'll have supper in 20 minutes. His tone was flat, professional. The voice of a man who'd spent the war learning what not to do. That night, Helene couldn't sleep. She replayed the moment in her head. The sound of running water, the guards' backs turned, the strange mercy of being unseen. In her notebook, she wrote one sentence before the lights went out. They looked away, and that's the kindest thing I've ever known. The next morning, she noticed something different. The guards kept their distance as always, but their silence felt lighter now, less like suspicion, more like intention. The women began to walk taller. The guards stopped staring at the ground, and in that narrow space between power and fear, a fragile order took hold. One built not on force, but on restraint. They had all entered the camp believing the other side was cruel. They were both wrong. Not hatred, but hesitation. Not shame, but silence. Not cruelty, but control. The war had ended on paper, but here, between two kinds of wounded pride, it was still being rewritten, one quiet act at a time. Before Texas, there was Bremen. Helene Richter could still smell the soot when she closed her eyes. The city burned 3 times before it broke, and she'd walked through it after each bombing, stepping over glass and twisted rails to reach the field hospital. She'd been a nurse since 19, trained to stop bleeding, not ask questions. The war had stripped her of more than faith. It had stripped her of the idea that gentleness could survive men. By 1945, she wasn't a believer in anything. When she was captured near Le Havre, she didn't cry. She didn't resist. She just waited for whatever came next. What came was silence, and that was the strangest thing of all. Camp Hearn had started as a training post in 1942, but by the end of the war, it was home to thousands of German POWs, farmers, U-boat sailors, engineers. Most were men. The women were different. There were only 23 of them, pulled from transport ships and reassigned here by bureaucrats who didn't know what else to do with them. The army didn't plan for women prisoners. They improvised. And the man chosen to run their section was Captain Seth Marshall, a rancher from Abilene who'd traded a lasso for a Colt, 45. He'd seen combat in France, but he'd lost more friends to exhaustion than bullets. He was a soldier because he had to be, but the old cowboy was still there, buried under the uniform. His men called him quiet, strange, too calm. But when he spoke, people listened. You don't have to like them, he told his guards before the women arrived. You just have to behave better than the men they ran from. The guards were farm boys, Texans raised on heat, horses, and rules that didn't need to be written down. You didn't hit what couldn't hit back. You didn't stare when a woman looked away. You didn't cross a door that wasn't yours. That was Marshall's Texas. And now it was the camp's law. He kept a small notebook in his pocket. The first page read, "Command by distance, mercy by control." Every morning he made his rounds. He spoke little German, but he didn't need to. The women avoided eye contact. The men returned the favor. The silence worked better than orders ever did. The camp itself was plain. A grid of wooden huts, a kitchen, a latrine, a small garden plot near the fence. The windmill that powered the water tank was the only sound between meals. Marshall made sure it never stopped turning. A man who can't give water, he said, has no right to wear a uniform. That was why the showers mattered. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about proof. Proof that they weren't what everyone said they were. Proof that war hadn't broken everything. There were rules, written and unwritten. The Army's handbook said each PW was to receive 1 bath per week under supervision. Marshall's revision was simple. No supervision, no shame. Guards outside only. He didn't explain it, but the guards understood. They stood their posts, rifles ready, backs turned, eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't leniency. It was discipline. The first week passed without incident. The women still flinched at every sound. The men still avoided looking directly at them, but something subtle had shifted. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was cautious, yes, but balanced. Marshall's log entries were spare. Prisoners calm, ration sufficient, no issues. But one line stood out in smaller handwriting, tucked beneath the official record. They don't trust kindness yet, but it's working. For Helene, the strangest part wasn't the food or the beds or even the warm water. It was the way the Americans looked away. They could have reminded her of everything the war had taken. Instead, they acted as if it hadn't been taken at all. When she lay awake that night, listening to the creak of the windmill and the far-off sound of crickets, she realized something terrifying and beautiful. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was being seen and spared. Not command but care. Not power but patience. Not redemption but restraint. And it was that restraint, more than mercy, that began to heal her. War turned people into numbers, and Texas kept its books clean. 425,000 German POWs were held in the United States between 1,942 and 1,946. 50,000 of them lived behind Texan fences, and among them fewer than 100 women. Fewer than 100 names buried in records labeled non-combatant female detainees. Camp Hearn had 23 women who no one knew what to do with. 10 guards, 1 captain, 1 unspoken rule. No man crosses the door when the women wash. The military ledger said, cleanliness, essential for morale. Showers to be conducted under armed supervision. Captain Marshall crossed out the last line. Wrote instead, supervision, unnecessary. Trust is stronger than inspection. That was his heresy and his experiment. Every detail was measured. Water rationed at 40 gallons per hour, 2 minutes per woman, 10 feet between door and guard. Marshall had calculated the entire ritual like a mathematician, not out of sentiment, but out of discipline. If every step had a rule, nothing could be misread. Nothing could be violated. Inside, the women had their own numbers. 16 steps from bunk to shower house, 4 steps down to the door, 2 knocks before entry. They counted everything because numbers meant control. Control meant survival. But what neither side counted was the silence. The silence had its own math. 30 minutes of running water, 10 men outside unmoving, 0 voices, 0 laughter, 0 eyes crossing that wooden wall. Those zeros told the real story. They were impossible numbers in war. 0 misconduct, 0 punishments, 0 complaints. The records would later call Camp Hearn's female detachment anomalous, a miracle by omission, a proof that mercy could be written in the negative. To Helene, it was something stranger. The guards' refusal to look wasn't just obedience. It was effort. She could see it in the way their shoulders stiffened when they heard movement, the way they forced their gaze outward. Mercy, she realized, wasn't softness. It was labor. That understanding came with shame. We were ready to hate them, she whispered one night. We wanted them to fail. Inga nodded. So we could be right. But they didn't, Helene said. They keep not failing. Outside, the guards measured time differently. They didn't count women. They counted seconds. The length of each rotation, the hum of each valve, the shift of weight in their boots as the water started and stopped. Every motion was ritual, and every silence was a promise. Private Davis once asked, "Why do we bother, sir? They wouldn't do the same for us." Captain Marshall replied, "That's why we do it." He knew the math of destruction. Tons of bombs, millions of shells, hours of slaughter. But this was the opposite. The math of decency. 10 guards, 23 women, 3 showers a week, 0 incidents, and an equation that shouldn't have worked, but did. Each number was a quiet rebellion against everything the war had taught them. Helene began keeping her own record in the back of her diary. She drew 2 columns before and now. Before hunger, shouting, eyes. Now, food, silence, distance. She added a line at the bottom. Before fear meant survival, now silence does. The next day, Marshall read a report from another camp, one where order had failed, where a single guard's mistake had destroyed months of fragile trust. He folded the paper, looked out at the Texas sun, and whispered, "That's what mercy costs when it breaks." He didn't know his own camp statistics would vanish after the war. No medals, no mention, just zeros in forgotten files. But those zeros were everything. They were proof that civilization hadn't died completely in 1945. Because in a world obsessed with how many enemies it killed, Camp Hearn was one of the few places that counted how many it didn't. Not victory but vigilance. Not forgiveness but distance held steady. Not absence of violence, but the presence of control. The math of restraint. The hardest equation any soldier ever kept. The test came when mercy met instinct. It happened quietly, as most things at Camp Hearn did. A slip, a moment, a choice. It was a Sunday afternoon, wind low, heat sharp enough to make the tin walls hum. The women had just finished their weekly laundry, scrubbing their uniforms in galvanized tubs near the shower house. The air smelled like soap, iron and sunlight. Helene was wringing out a towel when her hand slipped. The edge of the metal basin caught her wrist, slicing deep enough to bleed. She gasped, pressing her hand to her chest, blood bright against the grey fabric. A guard nearby, Private Davis, heard it. He took one step forward before stopping dead. He looked to Captain Marshall, who was standing under the windmill with a clipboard. Marshall nodded once. Davis approached, slow, careful, the way you'd walk toward a wild horse. "You hurt?" he asked. Helene didn't answer. She backed away, clutching her hand, waiting for the roughness that always came next. The grab, the yank, the humiliation. But Davis didn't move closer. He crouched, pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, and set it on the ground between them. "You can use that," he said quietly. Clean cloth. He didn't reach for her, didn't insist. He just waited. For a long moment no one breathed. Then she bent, picked up the handkerchief, and wrapped it around her wrist. "Danke," she whispered. Davis nodded, stepped back, and said, "It's okay, ma'am." That word, ma'am, hit harder than kindness. No one had called her that in years. The other women had watched, frozen. When he walked away, one of them whispered, "He didn't touch you." Helene's voice shook. No, he didn't. From the shade of the windmill, Marshall exhaled slowly. "That's it," he murmured to himself. "That's how you win." Later that day, he called his men together. "You all saw what happened. That's the line. You protect it. You keep it. No matter what." Lewis frowned. "Sir, it's just a cut." "It's never just a cut," Marshall said. "It's what comes next that counts." That night, the camp was quiet. The women washed again at sundown. The guards stood their distance, same as always, eyes fixed on the horizon. But something in the air had changed. Less fear, more trust, a fragile truce sealed by a single unbroken boundary. When Helene returned to her bunk, she opened her small notebook. On a torn scrap of the handkerchief she wrote, "He left it on the ground." That phrase became a kind of prayer in the camp. Words passed between women when doubt returned. He left it on the ground, meaning he gave help, not harm. The next morning, Marshall added a line to his logbook. Assistance rendered, no contact. 2 words that meant everything. Days later, a storm hit. Thunder over flat land, rain falling in thick sheets. The women rushed to secure their laundry lines, laughing as the wind whipped the sheets into ghosts. Marshall watched from his post, water dripping from his hat. It was the first time he saw them laugh without fear. Lewis grinned. "Guess they're not scared anymore, sir." Marshall didn't smile. "No," he said. "Now they're human again. That's scarier." The storm ended before sundown. The air smelled clean. In the fading light, the guards lined up outside the shower house, same as before, backs turned, boots planted in the wet earth. Inside, the women bathed in the warmth left by the storm, water mixing with rain. Helene raised her wrist to her face, the cut already fading beneath the white cloth. She thought of the man who hadn't touched her, the man who'd called her ma'am. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She whispered to the woman beside her, "They're not our captors." "What are they then?" She looked toward the closed door where the silhouettes of cowboys stood against the last light. "Our witnesses," she said. "Not conquerors, not saviors, witnesses to the possibility that decency could survive anything." That night, as the last drops fell from the roof, Marshall closed his eyes and listened. The sound of rain was the same as water on skin, steady, clean, endless. And for a few minutes the world felt forgiven. By winter the silence had become ritual. No orders, no shouting, no fear. Only distance measured in footsteps and seconds. The system worked because everyone obeyed the math of restraint. 23 women, 10 guards, 1 captain, 0 violations. But holding that number steady took more effort than anyone admitted. Marshall knew it. Mercy, he realized, was a kind of exhaustion. Every man on the line felt it. The constant control, the quiet tension of being good when it would be easier to stop trying. He began to notice small cracks in the rhythm. A guard who stared too long at the ground as the women passed. Another who lingered by the showers after dismissal, just listening to the sound of water. It wasn't lust. It was curiosity. The mind's dangerous drift toward what was forbidden. He called them together one night by the windmill. The air was cold, their breath visible. "You've been perfect," he said. "And that's the problem. Perfect breaks first." Lewis frowned. "Sir." Marshall looked past him toward the lights of the barracks. "Discipline doesn't mean never wanting to fail. It means not letting it show." He dismissed them early, stayed by himself a while, hat in hand, listening to the creak of the tower above. The water tank groaned. The sound reminded him of the first week, the first shower. The same uneasy stillness before trust began. Inside the barracks, the women were changing too. They'd stopped jumping at every sound. They'd started singing while they worked. Their fear had thinned, and something softer had taken its place. But that new calm brought its own confusion. One night, Helene found herself standing by the window, staring toward the line of guards. They were shadows in the moonlight, motionless, eyes turned outward. She wondered what it must feel like to hold back every instinct, to protect someone by pretending not to see them. In her journal, she wrote, "They make us safe by pretending we aren't here. But maybe that's harder than cruelty." The next morning, one of the guards, Private Harland, approached Captain Marshall, hat in hand. "Sir, I'm requesting reassignment." "Reason?" Marshall asked. Harlan hesitated. "It's not right, sir. The way they look at us now, it's grateful. I can't stand it." Marshall studied him for a long moment. "You're not the first man who's felt shame when he's done something right. Go. You've earned the transfer." Harlan left the next day. That night, Marshall sat at his desk, the lamplight flickering against the logbook. He wrote, "Every man here is at war with himself, and we're losing slower than usual." The next evening, the water tank cracked again. The women stopped what they were doing, listening as the guards ran toward the noise. The hiss of steam filled the air, and for a second, the scene replayed itself. Men moving, women watching, everyone frozen in the same fear of crossing the line. But Marshall stopped them with a single order. "No one goes inside." They waited silent until the steam cleared. Then he nodded to the women. "You can handle it. Go on." Helene stepped forward, took a wrench, tightened the valve. The hiss faded. The guard stepped back. Afterward, she turned to Marshall. "We can fix what's broken," she said in careful English. He nodded. "So can we." When the water began to flow again that night, it sounded different, softer, slower, almost human. The women didn't cry this time. The men didn't look away in pain. Everyone just breathed. But Marshall knew what the silence meant. The system was holding barely. Mercy could only last as long as exhaustion allowed it. And when the last man, too tired to care, finally turned around, the whole thing would break. He closed his notebook with a sigh. The math was simple but brutal. Discipline equals distance plus time, divided by desire. He looked out the window at the line of barracks, their shadows long under the moon. The women were sleeping. The guards were standing still. The camp was a perfect equation balanced on one impossible number. 0, he whispered. "Just hold. Because once you teach men to stop fighting, you have to pray they never forget how. Not peace, but pressure. Not kindness, but calculation. Not freedom, but the fragile physics of decency. And all of it, every rule, every breath could collapse with a single step forward." February 1946. The cold came late that year, sliding across Texas like a thin gray sheet. The mornings were pale, the ground stiff with frost. The women woke early, breath clouding in the barracks, hands raw from washing uniforms in freezing water. The guards moved slower, too, stamping their boots to keep blood in their feet. One morning, the pump feeding the water tower froze solid. No showers, no water for cooking, No warmth except what the small stove in the barracks could give. By noon, tempers were thin. The women muttered among themselves in German. The guards shifted in the yard, waiting for orders. Captain Marshall arrived with a spanner and a bucket of boiling water. "We'll fix it," he said. Private Lewis hesitated. "Sir, shouldn't we?" "I said we'll fix it," Marshall repeated. He didn't mean the machine. He meant the mood. He approached the frozen pump, the metal white with ice. Steam rose as he poured the hot water over the valve. Nothing moved. The pump groaned but didn't give. From behind the fence, a voice called out in accented English. "More hot." Marshall turned. It was Helene, her arms wrapped in a blanket. She pointed to the pipe, nodding like a nurse diagnosing a patient. "You hit, then pour," he frowned. "You think so?" She nodded. "We do this in Bremen. When pipes freeze, you must hit first, then heat." He handed his wrench to Lewis. "Do what she says." The guard struck the pipe. Once, twice. The ice cracked. Steam hissed. Then the pump shuddered, coughing out a rush of brown water before clearing to clear steady flow. The tank above them rumbled awake. A cheer went up from both sides of the fence. Small, uncertain, but real. Marshall turned to Helene. "You've done this before." She smiled, a thin, cautious smile. "Many winters, always cold, always pipes." He nodded. "Well, you just saved breakfast." That night he sent 2 of his men to deliver an extra crate of firewood to the women's barracks. They didn't enter, they just left it by the door. The next morning, the crate was gone, and in its place sat a note written in German, careful block letters, translated later by a clerk. "For the water, thank you. For the distance, thank you more." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who had written it. After that, the boundaries began to shift again. Not closer, not broken, just warmer. The guards no longer stood like statues. The women no longer averted their eyes every second. When they passed each other near the mess hall, some nodded, others murmured greetings. Helene began volunteering in the infirmary, tending to small cuts and sprains. She didn't speak much English, but she didn't need to. Her hands were steady. When she wrapped a guard's bandaged wrist one morning, she said softly, "No pain now," he answered. "Only tired," she smiled faintly. War makes everyone tired. That night, Captain Marshall wrote in his logbook, "They fix what they can. We hold what we must." The balance still holds. The next week, rain came. Real Texas rain, thick and heavy. The camp turned to mud. The showers filled with steam again. The guards took their places, same as always, backs turned, rifles resting. Inside, the women watched in silence, their voices mixing with the rain. Through the tin walls, Marshall could hear faint singing, a German hymn, quiet but steady. It wasn't for God. It was for themselves. When they stepped out, the mud pulled at their boots. Marshall tipped his hat, nodded once. "Evening, ladies." Helene hesitated, then said in halting English, "Good night, Captain." It was the first time she'd used his name. He turned away before she saw him smile. Not command, not forgiveness, just something rare. Mutual grace learned through repetition. For the rest of the war, Camp Hearn's water tower never froze again. And somewhere in the file room of the UMNS Army, a note was added to the end of a routine report. Prisoner morale high. Relations between guards and female detainees exemplary. The kind of sentence that hides an entire story inside it. A story about pipes, frost, distance, and the strange warmth that can live even inside captivity. Not love, not peace. Just proof that decency, like water, finds its own level. March 1946. The bluebonnets had started blooming on the edge of the camp. Small flashes of color against the pale earth. The wind was softer now, carrying the smell of wet grass and cedar. For the first time in months, the war felt far away. That morning, an army jeep rolled into Camp Hearn. Out stepped Major Whitman, a logistics officer from the regional command. His uniform was crisp, his tone harder than the weather. He was there to inspect. "Captain Marshall," he said, shaking his hand with the stiffness of someone already suspicious. "I've heard you run this camp differently." Marshall didn't blink. "We run it right." Whitman scanned the yard, his eyes landing on the women moving between the barracks and the shower house, their posture calm, unguarded. "They seem too comfortable." "They're clean," Marshall said. Comfort's just the side effect. Whitman frowned. I read your reports. No discipline issues, no incidents. Not one. You expect me to believe that? Marshall shrugged. You don't have to believe it. You just have to see it. Whitman spent the day observing, walking the perimeter, watching guards at their posts, scribbling notes. That evening, he returned as the women prepared for their shower rotation. The same ritual, the same silence. Where's your supervision? He asked. Outside, Marshall replied. I mean inside. There is no inside supervision, Marshall said. They're entitled to privacy under Article 12 of the Geneva Convention. Whitman snorted. You're telling me you just let them in there alone? Yes, sir. And the men just wait? They wait, Marshall said evenly. And they don't look. Whitman's jaw tightened. You're a damn fool, Captain. You've forgotten what they are. Marshall's voice stayed low. No, sir. I remember exactly what they are. That's why this works. The Major turned on his heel and left, muttering about softness and scandal. That night the guards stood outside the showers as usual. The sound of water filled the air, rhythmic, constant, but there was something else beneath it. A song. The women were singing again, the same hymn, faint but unmistakable. Whitman heard it from his quarters. They're singing, he said, disgusted. You've turned this place into a sanctuary. Marshall didn't argue. He only said, it's cleaner than a battlefield. The next morning, the Major ordered a surprise inspection. He demanded to walk the barracks, check supplies, question prisoners. Marshall followed him silently. The women stood straight as he passed, their eyes steady but unafraid. When he reached the showers, he hesitated. The air was still damp from the morning wash. Soap and steam clung to the walls. They should be supervised, Whitman said again. Marshall pointed toward the doorframe. Look at the floor. The Major frowned. The wood there was worn smooth, not from boots, but from the guards who had stood in the same spot every night for 6 months. Unmoving. That's supervision, Marshall said. Discipline leaves marks too. Whitman didn't respond. He left 2 hours later, his report unsigned. That evening, Marshall gathered his men. You did well today. You stood straighter when he was watching, but you never stopped facing the field. That's the kind of strength he'll never understand. Lewis grinned. Reckon he'll shut us down, sir? Marshall shook his head. No, he's going to pretend we don't exist. It's easier that way. Inside the barracks, the women passed around small sheets of paper, scraps torn from old Red Cross forms. On them were short notes written in careful handwriting. Thank you for silence. Thank you for distance. Thank you for not changing when they came. Helene folded hers and slipped it under Marshall's office door that night. He found it later, simple, unsigned. He didn't keep it in his journal. He kept it in his breast pocket. The camp carried on. The showers steamed. The guards waited. The world forgot. But the moment had been tested, and it had held. When the next shipment of supplies came in, the army clerk at the depot read the file marked Hearn P. W. Detachment Female Section. Next to the column labeled Security Complaints, there was just one word typed neatly in black ink. None. Not peace, but proof. Not command, but conviction. Not weakness, but the weight of doing nothing when everything in you wants to act. And that, Captain Marshall knew, was the real war. And somehow in this tiny camp lost to time, they'd won it. April 1946. The orders came through like they always did. Thin, typed, indifferent. Female German prisoners to be repatriated by end of month. It sounded clinical, almost bureaucratic, but in Camp Hearn, it felt like thunder. The women lined up by the gate that morning, uniforms pressed, hair neatly braided. The guards stood opposite them, silent. For 6 months they'd lived in a fragile truce, built out of restraint, repetition, and the sound of water falling behind closed doors. Now it was ending. Helene clutched her small notebook to her chest, the one filled with half-English, half-German notes about the strange decency she had seen here. She looked at Captain Marshall standing near the trucks. He was the same as always, hat low, sleeves rolled, face unreadable. The translator read the instructions. You are going home. You will be transported to Galveston, then to Europe. Your conduct here has been noted as exemplary. The word hung in the air, awkward and heavy. Exemplary. It meant nothing to soldiers, but to these women it meant everything. Helene stepped forward, holding something in her hand, a folded towel embroidered with a single word. Danke. She hesitated, then extended it toward Marshall. He shook his head. Keep it. No, she said softly. You kept us clean. It's yours. He took it slowly. It wasn't me. It was the rules. She smiled faintly. Rules don't look away. Men do. He had no answer. Behind her, the others bowed deeply before climbing into the trucks. The guards removed their caps. No one saluted. No one spoke. As the engines rumbled to life, the dust lifted off the road, swirling like smoke. Marshall stood still, the towel still in his hands. When the last truck disappeared over the horizon, the camp felt hollow, too quiet even for Texas. That night, he opened his journal for the final time. His handwriting was smaller now, more deliberate. 23 German women, no incidents, no violations, no shame. The record will say nothing happened here, but something did. We proved it's possible. He closed the book and looked toward the shower house, the tin roof glowing faintly in the moonlight. The door was open. The air inside was dry, still smelling faintly of soap. He thought of the sound he'd heard for months, the rhythm of water, laughter muffled by walls. The silence of men who stood guard over decency itself. Not one of them had crossed the door. Not one, he whispered to the empty air. That's how wars should end. The next morning, when the army truck came to dismantle the camp, the workmen found a note pinned to the shower door in faded handwriting. They couldn't read the German, but later someone translated it. They waited outside. That is why we survived. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Years later, when the land was returned to ranchers, all that remained were the foundations of the barracks, a rusted windmill, and the concrete base of the old shower house. On it, the faint outline of 2 boot prints faced away from the door. Maybe they belonged to Marshall, maybe to some nameless guard who never broke the rule. It didn't matter. They were proof that something sacred had existed there, a boundary that had held against the worst the world could offer. The war had taught men to kill without flinching. Camp Hearn had taught them something harder, how to hold still when every instinct screamed to move. Not conquest, but conscience. Not pity, but patience. Not victory, but the quiet triumph of control. The trucks carried the women home. The silence stayed behind. Years later, the Texas field where Camp Hearn once stood lay open again. Just grass, wind, and a rusted windmill creaking against the horizon. The barracks were gone. The fences had rotted into the dirt. Only the concrete foundation of the shower house remained, its edges cracked, the ground around it smooth from rain. Old men said you could still hear the wind sing through the grass the way it used to hum through those tin walls. Not ghosts, just memory that refused to fade. In 1955, Captain Seth Marshall returned. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a rancher again, boots heavy with dust, hat shading eyes that had seen too much. He parked his truck at the edge of the field and walked to the foundation. He ran his hand along the rough concrete, feeling the same cold surface that had once separated 2 worlds, fear and restraint, enemy and human. He still carried the towel Helene had given him, folded neatly in his breast pocket. The embroidery had faded, but the word was still there. Danke. He laid it down in the dust and said quietly, "You earned that, not me." The wind picked up, rustling the grass, carrying the faint smell of cedar and rain. Half a world away in Bremen, Helene sat at her kitchen table, grey hair tied back, a bar of American soap wrapped in cloth, resting beside her teacup. She had never used it. When her granddaughter once asked why, she said, "Because it smells like mercy." The girl didn't understand. Few ever did. That night, Helene opened her old notebook, its pages brittle, its ink fading. On the last page she had written years earlier, "They waited outside the door." That's all they did. That's everything they did. She closed it and looked out the window toward the harbor lights. The wind outside sounded like rain, like water falling on tin. In Texas, Marshall stood for a while longer, watching the sunset burn low over the horizon. He thought of all the reports he'd written, the numbers that had meant nothing to anyone but him. 23 women, 10 men, 6 months, 0 incidents. A perfect equation in an imperfect world. He turned to leave but stopped halfway and looked back one last time. The windmill groaned, the blades turning slow, steady, endless. He whispered, "Not weakness, just strength used differently." Then he climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving the field to silence. The sun dropped below the horizon, and for a moment the wind sounded like running water again. The same sound that had once filled that camp, the sound of mercy disguised as duty. Because in that forgotten place, between shame and dignity, between fear and restraint, the war had ended one last time, quietly, correctly, completely. Not through victory, not through surrender, but through something rarer, the courage to wait outside the door,